August 8, 2022, 6:03 a.m. The sun hadn't yet broken over the Atlantic when the first vehicle approached the gates. No sirens, no warnings, just the quiet hum of engines and the metallic click of equipment being checked one final time. By 9:15 a.m., federal agents were walking through rooms that had hosted presidents, diplomats, and some of the most powerful people on Earth. They were searching a mansion that, for nearly a century, had been designed to be untouchable, not because of who lived there, but because of what was built to protect. This is Mar-a-Lago, 17 acres stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon, 126 rooms, 36,000 antique tiles, a house so large that the woman who built it needed a staff of 60 just to maintain it. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Mar-a-Lago was never supposed to be a private home. It was designed as something else entirely. A palace, a fortress, a transfer point for power that was never meant to stay in one family's hands. And the woman who built it? She knew exactly what she was doing. Marjorie Merriweather Post constructed this estate in the 1920s when she was one of the wealthiest women in America. She filled it with treasures collected from around the world. She hosted presidents, diplomats, foreign dignitaries, and intelligence operatives within its walls. She believed it would endure forever. She was almost wrong. After her death, the property changed hands, changed purpose, and nearly vanished entirely. The government rejected it as too expensive. Buyers walked away. Demolition permits were approved. For a brief moment in 1985, wrecking crews stood ready to reduce Marjorie Post's dream to rubble. That never happened. Instead, a New York real estate developer made a phone call, and what happened next would change the trajectory of American history in ways no one saw coming. But to understand why federal agents walked through those doors on August 8, 2022, to understand why this mansion has been at the center of conspiracy, power, and scandal for nearly 100 years, you have to go back to a Spanish cargo ship that never reached its destination, back to 20,000 coconuts that washed ashore and turned an uninhabited island into the winter capital of American wealth, back to a serial heiress who built a palace not for comfort, but for control, because Mar-a-Lago wasn't just built to impress. It was built to endure. It was built to outlast governments, survive wars, and remain standing long after the people who walked its halls were gone. And it has. This is a story of an estate that refused to disappear. A story of wealth, power, espionage, and the dark secrets hidden in plain sight. A story that begins long before architects drafted plans or workers laid foundation stones. It begins with an accident, a shipwreck, and the unlikely series of events that turned forgotten Barrier Island into the most dangerous address in America. If you think you know Mar-a-Lago, you don't. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear has never been told like this before. And if this story fascinates you, if you want the full, unfiltered truth about power, legacy, and the mansions that hold America's darkest secrets, leave a comment below. Tell me, what do you think Mar-a-Lago was really built for? Now, let's go back to 1878 and the shipwreck that started it all. That shipwreck off the Florida coast spilled 20,000 coconuts into the surf. Within a decade, palm groves lined what locals started calling Palm Beach. By the 1920s, it had become the winter playground of America's wealthiest families. But here's what most people don't know. One woman looked at Palm Beach and saw something everyone else missed. While her fellow millionaires were building winter cottages to escape New York's cold, she was planning something that had nothing to do with vacation. Her name was Marjorie Merriweather Post. And in 1923, when she started buying land on that barrier island, she wasn't thinking about parties or ocean views. She was thinking about permanence, about what happens when power needs a place to go. May 9th, 1914. Marjorie was 27 years old when she received the telegram. Her father, Charles William Post, had taken his own life at his California estate. He was 59. His health had been failing. He saw no way forward. The Postum Cereal Company, the empire he'd built from a barn in Battle Creek, Michigan, was now hers. All of it, $20 million. That's over $500 million in today's money. But more than that, she inherited control of one of the fastest growing food empires in America. Most people thought she'd sell. A 27-year-old woman in 1914 couldn't run a corporation. Women couldn't even vote yet. But here's what they didn't understand about Marjorie Merriweather Post. She'd been attending board meetings since she was 10 years old. Father had trained her for this moment her entire life. While other girls her age were learning embroidery, Marjorie was learning finance, manufacturing, marketing, the brutal mechanics of building empires. She didn't just inherit money. She inherited hunger. And by 1923, she turned that hunger into something no one saw coming. She divorced her first husband. He didn't understand business. In 1920, she married Edward Francis Hutton, stockbroker, strategist, a man who saw opportunities where others saw risk. Together, they took Post in public in 1922. Then they started acquiring Jell-O in 1925, Maxwell House Coffee in 1928, and in 1929, something that would change American life forever. They were sailing off the Massachusetts coast when their cook served dinner. The goose had been frozen solid for 6 months, yet it tasted fresh, perfectly textured, no ice crystals, no freezer burn. The technology was called flash freezing, invented by a man named Clarence Birdseye. Marjorie saw immediately what it meant. Her mother had spent endless hours canning food on their Michigan farm. Any technology that saved housewives that labor would change everything. Hutton was cautious. Grocers would need expensive freezers. Consumers weren't ready. Marjorie overruled him. They bought Birdseye's company for $22 million in 1929. The Postum Cereal Company became General Foods Corporation. Marjorie Merriweather Post was now one of the most powerful businesswomen in the country. But power like that creates a problem. Where do you put it? Not in New York, where everyone watches. Not in Chicago, where the business world never sleeps. Somewhere else. Somewhere warm. Private. Remote enough to control who enters, but close enough to Washington that the right people could visit. In 1923, Marjorie went looking for land in Palm Beach. According to reports, she crawled through dense underbrush with her realtor, searching. Most of the oceanfront was already claimed by other wealthy families. She needed something specific, substantial acreage, water views in both directions, and most importantly, solid coral foundation. She found 17 acres. It stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way across the island to Lake Worth Lagoon. The parcel sat on coral reef strong enough to support something massive, something that would need to survive hurricanes, something built to last. She reportedly paid only $100 for the land. $100 for 17 acres of oceanfront property. Now, why would one of America's wealthiest women get prime Palm Beach real estate for the price of a cheap suit? Because in 1923, that land wasn't desirable yet. It was scrub brush and rock between two bodies of water. Undeveloped. Unwanted. Marjorie saw what it would become, and she had the money to make it happen. She hired Marion Sims Wyeth first. He was a Beaux-Arts trained architect who designed elegant homes throughout Palm Beach. Conservative. Refined. He understood her taste. But for this project, she wanted more than architecture. She wanted theater. So she brought in Joseph Urban. Urban wasn't a traditional architect. He was a Viennese set designer who created stages for Metropolitan Opera and worked with Florence Ziegfeld on Broadway. He understood spectacle. He knew how to make spaces feel like they had power baked into the walls. Wyeth would handle structure and layout, making sure the building could withstand Category 5 hurricanes. Urban would handle the experience, making sure everyone who walked through the doors felt small. Construction began in 1924. The official story says it took 3 years and $7 million to complete. That's roughly $127 million today. But here's what the official story doesn't tell you. 600 workers labored on that estate. Most of them weren't local. 300 came from Europe specifically to work on Mar-a-Lago. Craftsmen, sculptors, specialists in techniques that didn't exist in America. Why? Because Marjorie wasn't building a house. She was building a vault. 3 boatloads of Dorian stone were shipped from Genoa, Italy. That's fossil-bearing limestone, chosen because it ages rapidly, giving new construction the appearance of being centuries old. 36,000 antique Spanish tiles were installed by hand. Many dated back to the 15th century. They'd been collected by Louisine Havemeyer, one of the greatest art patrons in American history. 20,000 salmon pink roof tiles came from old Cuban houses, dismantled, shipped north, and reassembled tile by tile. Black and white marble floors, 2,200 square feet of it, were torn out of a Cuban castle and installed in Mar-a-Lago's dining room. Native cypress beams were sandblasted to look weathered, as if the house had stood for generations. Now ask yourself, why go through all that trouble? Why import materials from 3 different countries? Why hire European craftsmen when American workers were cheaper and available? Why build something designed to look ancient when it was brand new? Because Marjorie Merriweather Post knew something about power that most people never learn. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter how many companies you own. If you don't control the narrative, if you don't control the space, you control nothing. Mar-a-Lago was designed to feel older than America itself. To feel like it had always been there. Like it would always be there. Like power had a home that predated presidents and would outlast them. The house was finished in January 1927. 58 bedrooms. 33 bathrooms with gold-plated fixtures, which Marjorie insisted on not for luxury, but because gold doesn't tarnish. Easier to clean. Less maintenance. A 1,800 square foot living room with 42-foot ceilings. A 75-foot tower rising above the property, offering 360-degree views of the entire island. The entire structure was bolted to the coral reef beneath it with concrete and steel. Hurricane-proof. And hidden throughout the property, details most visitors never noticed. Underground tunnels connecting different wings. Spaces designed to be sealed off from the rest of the house. Rooms with no clear purpose in the architectural plans. Joseph Urban had designed it like a stage set. Each room had its own character, its own mood. You were supposed to feel different things in different spaces. Marion Sims Wyeth later distanced himself from the project. He called his own work quiet, subdued, rational. Mar-a-Lago was none of those things. Wyeth knew what it really was. Not a home, a machine. In January 1927, just before the official opening, Marjorie and Hutton hosted a private dinner, a test run. The guest list wasn't published. The attendees weren't named in any society pages. But within weeks, Mar-a-Lago had become the most talked about address in Palm Beach. Not because of its beauty, but because of who started showing up. Ambassadors, diplomats, European royalty, intelligence operatives moving between Washington and Havana during a time when Cuba was the Caribbean's political chessboard. Marjorie called it entertaining, but people who understood power called it something else. Now here's the question nobody asked in 1927. If Marjorie Merriweather Post was one of the wealthiest women in America running General Foods from New York, why did she need a fortress in Florida? What was she protecting? And more importantly, from whom? Because by the mid-1930s, Marjorie would do something that made even her closest friends question her loyalty. She would leave Mar-a-Lago empty for 5 years. And when she returned, she would bring with her a collection of treasures that would change the estate's purpose forever. But Post didn't intend Mar-a-Lago to remain hers. She had plans for this place. Plans that would take 50 years to unfold. Plans that involved the United States government, foreign intelligence, and a transfer of power that no one saw coming. If you're still watching, drop a comment below and tell me, do you believe architecture can be used as a tool of influence? Because what happened next at Mar-a-Lago will prove it. And make sure you hit that subscribe button, because Chapter 2 reveals the Moscow connection that changed everything. In 1935, Marjorie divorced Edward Hutton. The partnership that had built General Foods was over. Within months, she married Joseph E. Davies, a Washington lawyer with connections that reached into the White House. Then President Roosevelt made a phone call. He needed someone for a sensitive assignment, an ambassador to the Soviet Union, someone who understood power. Someone whose wife could handle the diplomatic theater that came with representing America in Stalin's Moscow. Davies took the job. Marjorie went with him. And Mar-a-Lago sat empty for 5 years. From 1936 to 1941, the most expensive private residence in Florida stood closed. The staff was dismissed. The rooms fell quiet. The fountain stopped running. Neighbors walked past those iron gates every day, wondering what had happened. But Marjorie wasn't abandoning Mar-a-Lago. She was preparing it for what came next. In Moscow, something unexpected happened. Stalin was liquidating the past. The Soviet government had seized treasures from the Romanov family after the revolution. Imperial porcelain, Faberge eggs, religious icons, furniture from the Winter Palace. Priceless artifacts that had survived centuries. The Soviets needed hard currency to fund industrialization. They were selling everything. Marjorie started buying. Systematically. Quietly. She acquired chalices that had survived centuries in Russian churches, eggs crafted by Faberge of Tsars, portraits of empresses, furniture that had furnished palaces. The collection grew throughout their time in Moscow and continued afterward through dealers and auctions. By the time she finished, she had assembled the finest collection of Russian imperial art outside the Soviet Union itself. Now here's the question nobody asked at the time. Why was Stalin willing to sell these treasures to an American diplomat's wife? What did Marjorie offer in return besides money? Because by the time she returned to America in 1941, Marjorie Merriweather Post wasn't just a businesswoman anymore. She was a diplomatic asset. World War II changed everything. In 1944, Marjorie made Mar-a-Lago available for occupational therapy for wounded servicemen. Veterans recovering from combat trauma walked those grounds, participating in programs designed to help them heal. The public saw it as patriotic charity. But people close to Marjorie understood something else was happening. She was positioning Mar-a-Lago not as a private home, but as a national resource. She resumed full-time residence in 1948. The grand entertaining returned, dinner parties, charity galas, international visitors. In 1957, she began hosting the International Red Cross Ball annually. White tie, tails, tiaras required. The event became a Palm Beach institution, drawing diplomats, ambassadors, heads of state. But Marjorie was getting older, and she started planning what would happen after her death. In the late 1960s, she made a decision that shocked even her closest friends. She would give Mar-a-Lago to the United States government. Not sell it, give it. She wanted it to serve as a winter White House, a place where presidents could host foreign dignitaries, conduct diplomacy, escape Washington during the coldest months. Her lawyers structured the gift carefully. Upon her death, Mar-a-Lago would transfer to the National Park Service. She even established a trust fund to help offset maintenance costs. Congress approved the donation in 1972. President Nixon signed the acceptance legislation. On September 12, 1973, Marjorie Merriweather Post died at her Hillwood estate in Washington, D.C., after a long illness. She was 86 years old. Mar-a-Lago transferred to government ownership as planned. The mansion built for private power was now public property, or so everyone thought, because within months, problems started. Problems that didn't make sense if you believe the official story. Nixon had signed the acceptance legislation, but he already owned a Florida retreat. His compound in Key Biscayne, which he called the Florida White House. He visited Mar-a-Lago exactly once in 1974 for an inspection tour. Then Watergate consumed him. Gerald Ford preferred Colorado ski slopes to Florida beaches. Jimmy Carter's administration evaluated the property seriously. Staff toured the house. Security assessed the location. Their conclusion was devastating. The maintenance costs were too high, approximately $1 million per year. Security was nearly impossible. Palm Beach International Airport flight paths ran directly overhead. The location wasn't practical for presidential use. Now, pause for a moment. Think about what they're saying. The United States government, which maintains Camp David, multiple presidential retreats, diplomatic facilities worldwide, military bases on every continent, couldn't afford to maintain one mansion in Florida. The same government that operates Air Force One. that protects presidents wherever they go, that handles security for world leaders in dozens of countries. They're claiming a $1 million annual budget was too expensive. That's the official explanation. Here's the problem. It doesn't make sense. In 1980, the same year Mar-a-Lago was designated a National Historic Landmark, Congress quietly passed legislation returning the property. On December 23, 1980, the federal government gave Mar-a-Lago back to the Post Foundation. No ceremony, no explanation beyond cost and security. The National Park Service had never staffed it, never opened it to the public. For 7 years, the government had owned one of America's most significant estates and done absolutely nothing with it. Now ask yourself, if Mar-a-Lago was too expensive and too difficult to secure, why did they designate it a National Historic Landmark in 1980? Why protect a building you're about to abandon? Why give it the highest preservation status the government offers, then hand it back to the family that donated it? The Post Foundation listed it for sale at $20 million. Marjorie's daughters, including actress Dina Merrill, had no intention of maintaining the property. They wanted a buyer. The paint started peeling. The gardens grew wild. The house that Marjorie had kept immaculate for 50 years began to deteriorate. 3 potential sales fell through. Nobody wanted it. The maintenance costs scared away buyers. The scale was overwhelming. Operating a 126-room mansion required staff, resources, infrastructure that private ownership couldn't sustain. By 1985, demolition permits had been approved. Wrecking crews were preparing to reduce Marjorie Post's dream. The palace she'd spent $7 million building, the fortress designed to outlast governments, to rubble. Everything she'd built, everything she preserved through the Depression, through 2 world wars, through 5 decades of hosting presidents and diplomats and foreign leaders, about to be destroyed. Not by war, not by natural disaster, by economics. But here's what the official story doesn't tell you. There's a reason the government gave Mar-a-Lago back, a reason they couldn't keep it, a reason that had nothing to do with money or security or flight paths or maintenance costs. Because in 1985, while those demolition permits sat on someone's desk, a phone call was made from New York. A real estate developer who'd been watching Mar-a-Lago for 3 years made an offer. Not $20 million. Not even close. And what happened next? The deal that followed. The strategy behind it. The way one man acquired what the United States government had rejected. Would change American political history in ways nobody could have predicted. Then, quietly, without ceremony, the government gave it back. Drop a comment right now and tell me, why do you think the government really returned Mar-a-Lago? Because the official explanation doesn't add up. And if you're still watching, hit that subscribe button. November 1981. The deed transfer happened on a Wednesday. No press conference. No ribbon cutting. Just paperwork shuffled between the National Park Service and the Post Foundation attorneys. In a conference room, nobody photographed. Mar-a-Lago, the estate Congress had accepted with ceremony in 1972, was quietly returned to private hands. The official reason? Maintenance costs. But here's what didn't make the newspapers. During those 7 years of federal ownership, not a single president had slept there. Not one state dinner had been hosted. Not one diplomatic summit conducted. For 7 years, the United States government owned a fully furnished, hurricane-proof, historically significant mansion in one of the wealthiest zip codes in America, and did nothing with it. Gerald Ford had visited exactly once. Jimmy Carter's advance team toured it twice, filed reports, then never came back. Reagan's people didn't even bother looking. The house sat empty. 58 bedrooms. 33 bathrooms with gold-plated fixtures. An 1,800 square foot living room with ceilings higher than most people's houses. Empty. The fountains stopped running because nobody turned them on. The gardens grew wild because no one was assigned to tend them. Salt air from the Atlantic corroded window frames because maintenance crews were never dispatched. The Post Foundation received the property back in the same condition the government had left it, neglected. Now, if you're paying attention, something about this should bother you. The United States government maintains presidential retreats all over the world. Camp David costs millions annually. Secret Service secures temporary residences wherever the president travels. We protect embassies in war zones. We operate military installations in hostile territories. But a mansion in Palm Beach, less than 200 miles from Miami, 90 minutes from Cape Canaveral, surrounded by some of the wealthiest and most connected people in the world, was too expensive, too difficult to secure. The official explanation claimed airport flight paths made security impossible. But Palm Beach International Airport had been there since the 1930s. Marjorie Post knew about those flight paths when she donated the property. Presidents land at that airport regularly when visiting South Florida. So what changed between 1972 and 1980? Why did Congress accept a gift they never intended to use? And more importantly, why did nobody question it? Because here's what was happening during those same years. Watergate exploded in 1973, the same year Marjorie died and the property transferred. Nixon resigned in 1974. The Church Committee investigations began in 1975, exposing decades of CIA operations, covert surveillance programs, intelligence gathering on American soil. In 1975, a journalist named Seymour Hersh published reports about domestic spying. The public learned that intelligence agencies had been monitoring American citizens without warrants, that embassies and diplomatic facilities weren't just for diplomacy, that some buildings served purposes their architects never discussed in public. By 1977, Jimmy Carter was dismantling parts of the intelligence apparatus, reforming, cutting budgets, making transparency a priority, and suddenly maintaining a massive estate in Florida that Marjorie Merriweather Post, who'd spent 5 years in Stalin's Moscow during the height of pre-war tension, had donated specifically for government use became inconvenient. Not expensive, inconvenient. There's a difference. In December 1980, while America was distracted by the Iran hostage crisis and Reagan's incoming administration, Congress quietly passed legislation returning Mar-a-Lago. The Post Foundation didn't want it back. Marjorie's daughters had moved on with their lives. They had no interest in spending $1 million a year maintaining a house none of them wanted to live in, so they listed it for sale. $20 million. In 1981, that was a fortune even for Palm Beach. The asking price reflected not just the property value, but the cost of what came with it. The staff requirements, the upkeep, the endless repairs that a structure exposed to hurricanes and salt air demanded. Months passed. No serious offers. One buyer toured the property and walked away immediately after seeing the ballroom ceiling, where water damage had created brown stains across Joseph Urban's painted clouds. Another potential buyer wanted to subdivide the land, tear down the house, build condominiums facing both the ocean and Lake Worth Lagoon. The Palm Beach Town Council blocked that immediately. Mar-a-Lago had been designated a National Historic Landmark in 1980, the same year the government returned it. You couldn't demolish a National Historic Landmark without federal approval, so the house sat. The asking price dropped to $18 million. Still no buyers. By 1983, the Post Foundation was getting desperate. The carrying costs were crushing them. Property taxes in Palm Beach weren't cheap. Insurance on an unoccupied mansion was astronomical. And without staff maintaining it, the house was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. Hurricanes were the worst part. Every storm season brought new damage. Roof tiles cracked. Windows leaked. The salt air corroded metal fixtures that Marjorie had imported from Europe specifically because they were supposed to last forever. Nothing lasts forever when nobody's taking care of it. In 1984, the foundation received an offer, not for the house, for the land. A developer wanted to buy the beachfront portion, 3 acres facing the Atlantic, and build luxury homes. He offered $5 million for just that piece. The Post Foundation considered it seriously. $5 million was better than nothing. And if they could subdivide the property, sell off pieces gradually, they might recoup some value before the whole thing collapsed. But there was a problem. Mar-a-Lago's landmark status protected not just the house, but the entire estate. The 17 acres Marjorie had assembled specifically because they stretched from ocean to lagoon couldn't be subdivided without destroying what made the property historically significant. The deal fell through. By early 1985, contractors were being contacted about demolition, not because anyone wanted to destroy Mar-a-Lago, but because maintaining it was financially impossible. And if the foundation couldn't sell intact and couldn't subdivide it for development and couldn't donate it to anyone willing to accept the burden, the only option left was to tear it down and sell the land as a vacant lot. Permits were filed with Palm Beach County. Environmental assessments were ordered. Demolition crews began submitting bids for the job. Marjorie Merriweather Post's dream. The palace she'd spent $7 million building, the house designed to survive hurricanes and outlast governments, the estate she believed would serve presidents forever, was about to be reduced to rubble and sold as empty acreage. Then, in March 1985, a phone call came from New York. The caller identified himself as representing a real estate developer who'd been watching Mar-a-Lago for 3 years. He wanted to make an offer. Not 20 million, not 18, not even close to what anyone had considered reasonable. He offered $5 million for everything. The Post Foundation attorneys laughed. $5 million was an insult. The land alone was worth more than that. The house, despite its condition, contained antique tiles, marble floors, imported stonework worth millions if salvaged carefully. The caller didn't argue. He simply said his client wasn't interested in negotiating against himself. $5 million was the offer. Take it or leave it. Then he hung up. 2 weeks later, he called back. This time, the offer was different, structured differently. The developer would pay $3 million for Mar-a-Lago itself, the house, the main grounds, the furnishings, everything Marjorie had left inside. Separately, he would pay $2 million for the strip of land between Mar-a-Lago's western boundary and the Intracoastal Waterway, the narrow parts of the Post Foundation still owned but couldn't develop. Total, $5 million. But here's why the structure mattered. That narrow strip of land was the only thing preventing Mar-a-Lago from having direct beach access. The property touched the ocean, but you couldn't walk from the house to the beach without crossing that strip. The developer wasn't buying Mar-a-Lago for $5 million. He was buying it for $3 million, then buying the leverage for $2 million more. Because once he owned that connecting strip, Mar-a-Lago would have unobstructed access from a house to the Atlantic Ocean. And if he ever decided to sell, any future buyer would have to negotiate with him for that beach access. He wasn't buying a house. He was buying control. The Post Foundation accepted the offer in November 1985. The developer's name was Donald John Trump. He was 39 years old. He'd made his fortune building skyscrapers in Manhattan and casinos in Atlantic City. He'd never lived in Florida, had no apparent interest in Palm Beach society, and had just purchased one of America's most significant estates for less than the price of a Manhattan penthouse. The real estate community was baffled. Palm Beach society was horrified. Nobody understood what Trump planned to do with a 126-room mansion he couldn't possibly afford to maintain. Because here's what nobody knew yet. Trump hadn't bought Mar-a-Lago to live there. He'd bought it because he understood something about power that most people never learn. You don't need to use it. You just need to own it. And once you own it, you can change what it means. Mar-a-Lago had been designed as a fortress for private power, then as a symbol of public service, then as nothing at all. Trump was about to turn it into something else entirely, something that would require opening the gates Marjorie had spent 50 years keeping closed. But that transformation wouldn't happen immediately. First, there were battles to fight with the town of Palm Beach. Zoning wars that would drag through the courts for years. Neighbors who wanted nothing to do with whatever Trump was planning. And a house that was falling apart faster than even he had anticipated. Because when you buy a palace nobody else wanted, you inherit not just the building, but every problem that made everyone else walk away. If you're still watching, I need you to understand something. What happened to Mar-a-Lago between 1985 and 1995 isn't just a story about one man buying a mansion. It's about how power changes hands when everyone's looking the other way. Drop a comment right now and tell me, why do you think Trump wanted a property the government had rejected? Because what he did next, the legal battle, the zoning fight, the transformation of a national monument into something unprecedented, We'll show you how one person can rewrite history by controlling the space where history happens. Hit that subscribe button, because Chapter 4 reveals a decade-long battle that almost destroyed Mar-a-Lago for good. December 12, 1985. The closing took place in a West Palm Beach law office. Donald Trump signed paperwork transferring $5 million. $3 million for Mar-a-Lago, $2 million for the beach access strip. He'd just bought the 8th largest house in America, and he'd paid roughly the same price as a 2-bedroom apartment in Trump Tower. The Palm Beach social registry went cold. The old families, the Phippses, the Pulitzers, the Kennedys, had barely tolerated Marjorie Post. She'd earned her fortune in cereal and frozen food. Respectable, but still commerce. Trump was something else entirely. A New York developer. Casinos. Publicity. Tabloid divorces. Everything Palm Beach society worked very hard to avoid being associated with. But Trump didn't care about their approval. He cared about the asset he'd just acquired. Because what nobody understood, what even Trump's own lawyers didn't fully grasp, was that Mar-a-Lago came with something more valuable than the house itself. It came with possibilities. The property sat on 17 acres zoned as a single-family residence. Under Palm Beach regulations, that meant one family could live there, period. No commercial use. No subdivision. No hotel, no club, just a house. A massive, impossibly expensive, financially unsustainable house. Trump toured Mar-a-Lago for the first time as owner in January 1986. The damage was worse than he'd expected. Water stains covered ceilings throughout the east wing. Some of Joseph Urban's painted details had been destroyed by roof leaks that had gone unrepaired for years. Salt air had corroded bronze fixtures. Marble floors were cracked. The indoor pool had been drained years earlier and never refilled. Algae stained the tile. Estimates came back from contractors. Restoration would cost between $7 and $10 million. Trump had just spent $5 million buying property. Now, he was looking at potentially doubling that investment just to make it livable. He'd bought a palace that was slowly collapsing. But here's what Trump understood that nobody else had considered. Palm Beach society didn't want him there. Fine. He didn't need their approval. The town of Palm Beach didn't want commercial development. Fine. He'd work around it. And Mar-a-Lago's National Historic Landmark status, which everyone else saw as a restriction, Trump saw as leverage. Because landmark status means federal protection. It means the building can't be demolished. It means the property has historical significance that transcends local politics. And Trump was about to use that significance as a weapon. In 1986, he announced plans to subdivide 8 units, ultra-exclusive, multi-million-dollar price tags. He'd restore the house while converting it into residences for the wealthiest buyers in the world. The Palm Beach Town Council rejected the proposal immediately. The zoning didn't allow it. The landmark status prohibited substantial alterations. And subdividing Mar-a-Lago would destroy precisely what made it historically significant. The fact that it existed as a single unified estate. Trump appealed. The appeal was denied. So Trump did something unexpected. He announced plans to donate Mar-a-Lago back to the federal government. Not because he wanted to get rid of it, but because he knew exactly what had happened in 1980. The government had returned Mar-a-Lago because maintaining it was too expensive. If Trump offered to donate again, complete with its crushing maintenance costs, its deteriorating condition, its impossible overhead, the government would refuse. Again. And once they refused, Trump would have proof that Mar-a-Lago couldn't function as it was currently zoned. Not as a private residence for one family. Not as government property. Not as anything the town council claimed it should remain. In 1989, Trump's attorneys filed a new zoning application. This time, they weren't asking to subdivide. They were asking to convert Mar-a-Lago into a private club, a members-only social club where Trump could live on-site as the owner, while dues-paying members would have access to the property for social events, dining, gatherings. The town of Palm Beach rejected that too. Too much traffic, too many people, too much disruption to the quiet residential neighborhood surrounding the estate. Trump's attorneys came back with numbers. Mar-a-Lago cost approximately $1 million per year to maintain. Property taxes alone ran several $100,000. Insurance, staff, repairs, landscaping, utilities for a 126-room house with a 75-foot tower. The numbers were irrefutable. No single family could afford to operate Mar-a-Lago as a private residence. Not even Trump. And if the town council wouldn't allow commercial use, and the federal government wouldn't accept it as a donation, and nobody would ever pay enough to make the maintenance cost sustainable, then Mar-a-Lago would eventually be abandoned. Again, the only alternative was demolition, which the town couldn't allow because of landmark status. The zoning board was trapped. Trump had backed him into a corner where every option except the one he wanted was impossible. In 1992, he made one more move. He filed a lawsuit against Palm Beach County and the town of Palm Beach. The lawsuit claimed that zoning restrictions, combined with landmark designation, had rendered Mar-a-Lago economically unfeasible, that he'd purchased the property in good faith, only to discover that local regulations made it impossible to use. He wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was demanding compensation. Either allow the club or pay him for the taking. The lawsuit claimed damages in the tens of millions. The town couldn't afford that, and they knew Trump had the financial resources to drag the case through courts for years. In 1993, the town council quietly began negotiating. By 1995, a settlement was reached. Trump could open Mar-a-Lago as a private club, but with conditions. No more than 500 members. Strict limits on event sizes. Noise restrictions. Traffic management. Compliance with historical preservation standards. Annual reviews. And Trump had to agree to maintain Mar-a-Lago to National Historic Landmark standards in perpetuity. On January 1st, 1995, Mar-a-Lago Club officially opened. Initiation fee, $25,000. Annual dues, $1,000. Within 2 years, Trump would raise those numbers dramatically. By 2000, initiation was $100,000. By 2017, it would hit $200,000. But in 1995, what mattered wasn't the money. It was the transformation. A mansion that had been designed as a fortress for private power, that had been donated to serve as a winter White House, that had been rejected by the government and abandoned for demolition, was now a private club, where members paid to walk through rooms that Marjorie Post had spent decades filling with treasures, where strangers dined in the same ballroom where presidents and ambassadors had once gathered, where the architecture of power, the theater Joseph Urban had designed, was now available to anyone who could afford the fee. Trump had done what the United States government couldn't. He'd made Mar-a-Lago sustainable, but he'd also done something else. Something nobody fully understood until much later. He'd turned a national monument into a private space. A space where control belonged not to the public, not to elected officials, not to historians or preservationists, but to one person who decided who entered, who stayed, what happened inside those walls. And when history is controlled by a single owner, memory becomes negotiable. Mar-a-Lago had been built to endure. Now it would endure on Trump's terms. If you're still here, ask yourself this question. When a building designed for presidents becomes a private club, what else changes? Who gets to decide what's remembered? What stories get told? And which ones disappear behind locked gates? Drop a comment below and tell me, should a national historic landmark ever be privately controlled? Because what happened next at Mar-a-Lago, the events that unfolded between 1995 and 2022, will show you why that question matters more than you think. Hit subscribe. Because Chapter 5 reveals what happens when history disappears behind velvet ropes and security checkpoints. February 2000. A reporter from a Palm Beach Post requested access to tour Mar-a-Lago as part of a feature on historic estates. The request was denied. Mar-a-Lago Club policy. No media tours without owner approval. No photographs of interiors without permission. No access to guest lists, event schedules, or membership rosters. Marjorie Post had hosted journalists regularly. She understood publicity. She'd welcomed photographers, given interviews, shared her collection. Under Trump's ownership, those gates closed. Not because he was private, but because privacy had become the product. By 2000, Mar-a-Lago's initiation fee had reached $100,000. Membership was capped at $500. The exclusivity wasn't just about wealth. It was about access to a building most Americans would never see inside, to rooms filled with artifacts most historians couldn't study, to a space where deals were made, relationships formed, influence exchanged, all behind walls the public couldn't breach. Now here's where things get interesting. Mar-a-Lago's National Historic Landmark designation requires that the property remain historically significant and accessible for educational purposes. Federal law mandates that landmark status serves the public interest, not private profit. But there's no enforcement mechanism. The National Park Service can designate a property. They can revoke landmark status if the owner violates preservation standards. But they can't force access. They can't demand transparency. They can't require that history remain public. So Mar-a-Lago existed in a strange legal space, officially designated as nationally significant, functionally operated as a private club where membership bought silence as much as access. Trump lived on-site in a private residence carved out of the original structure. His family had their own wing, their own spaces. Members had access to the public areas, the ballrooms, the dining rooms, the terraces, the pool. But large sections of Mar-a-Lago remained off-limits even to them. Marjorie's bedroom suite, the tower, certain storage rooms, the underground passages connecting different wings. Those spaces existed, but nobody talked about them. Because here's what nobody outside Mar-a-Lago understood. When you control a historically significant space, you control more than architecture. You control narrative. What gets seen, what gets photographed, what gets discussed publicly, and what disappears into private memory. Between 2000 and 2015, dozens of events took place at Mar-a-Lago that never appeared in newspapers. Charity galas, yes, those were publicized. But private dinners attended by foreign businessmen, political donors, intelligence contractors, those happened too. And you'd never know unless you were in the room. In 2005, Trump married Melania Knauss at Mar-a-Lago. The wedding made headlines. The guest list included Bill and Hillary Clinton, along with dozens of other political and business figures. Photographs appeared in magazines. The event was documented. But 6 months later, a closed-door reception hosted by Trump at Mar-a-Lago for Eastern European energy executives went completely unreported. Because there were no press releases, no photographers, no guest list published, just private conversations in rooms built by a woman who'd spent 5 years in Stalin's Moscow and knew exactly how power moved through elegant spaces. By 2015, Trump was preparing to run for president. Mar-a-Lago became his base of operations during the campaign. Strategy sessions were held there. Donors were entertained there. Early cabinet picks were interviewed there. The property that Marjorie Post had explicitly donated to serve as a winter White House, that the government had rejected as unusable, was now functioning as exactly that, just under private ownership. After Trump won the election in November 2016, Mar-a-Lago became what the press started calling the Southern White House. Between January 2017 and August 2022, Trump spent approximately 150 days at the estate during and after his presidency. Foreign leaders visited. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe stayed there. Chinese President Xi Jinping held a summit there. Classified briefings were given on the outdoor terrace where club members were having dinner. In February 2017, news broke that Trump and Abe had discussed North Korea's missile program at an outdoor table while Mar-a-Lago members looked on and took cell phone photos. Security experts were horrified. Classified information discussed in semi-public space. But here's the question nobody could answer. What happened in the private spaces? The rooms where members didn't go, where staff were dismissed, where conversations happened without witnesses. Because Mar-a-Lago's design, those underground tunnels, those sealed wings, those spaces Joseph Urban had designed with theatrical purpose, meant that entire sections existed beyond observation. And once Trump left office in January 2021, those questions became urgent because unlike every previous president, Trump didn't return to a private residence with minimal security. He returned to a private club with 500 members, dozens of staff, constant events, regular guests. A place where classified documents from his presidency might be stored, where sensitive materials might exist in spaces designed for privacy, not security. Where the architecture of secrecy, built by Marjorie Post for purposes she never fully explained, was now housing secrets nobody could see. In June 2022, federal investigators visited Mar-a-Lago. They were looking for presidential records that should have been transferred to the National Archives. Trump's attorneys provided some documents, claimed that was everything. 2 months later, someone disagreed. On August 8, 2022, at 6:03 a.m., FBI agents arrived at Mar-a-Lago with a search warrant. No sirens, no warnings, just a quiet approach of vehicles carrying people authorized to enter spaces that had been closed to outsiders for 27 years. They walked through 126 rooms. They searched closets, storage areas, private quarters. They removed boxes containing classified documents. Hundreds of pages marked top secret. Materials that shouldn't have been there. The official statement said the documents had been improperly retained. But here's what the statement couldn't say. How long had those documents been there? What was in those sealed wings nobody talked about? What else existed in a mansion designed by a woman who collected treasures in Stalin's Moscow and returned to build a fortress that looked like a palace? Mar-a-Lago had been built to endure, to survive governments, outlast presidencies, remain standing when everyone else was gone. And it had. But in enduring, it had also become something Marjorie Post never intended, a place where history disappeared behind membership fees and security checkpoints, where the architecture of power served power itself, not the public interest, where a national historic landmark meant for the nation became a private stage where only certain people could see what was happening. The house was still there. The tiles Marjorie had imported, the marble sheets salvaged, the ceilings Joseph Urban had painted, all still there. But what they now contained, what they now protected, what they now concealed, that belonged to someone else. And the rest of us could only wonder what was happening behind those iron gates. If you made it this far, you need to understand what this story really means. It's not about one mansion. It's about what happens when power finds a permanent home. When architecture designed for control remains in hands that know how to use it. Drop a comment below. Do you think we'll ever know the full truth about what happened at Mar-a-Lago? Because the story isn't over. The mansion still stands. The gates still close. And history is still being written inside walls most of us will never see. February 11th, 2017, 9:47 p.m. The missile launched from North Korea while dessert was being served. Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister of Japan, sat at an outdoor table on Mar-a-Lago's terrace. The call came through. Classified information. Nuclear threat assessment. Members at surrounding tables held up their phones. One posted to Facebook, "It's fascinating to watch the flurry of activity." He photographed the military aide carrying the nuclear football, tagged him by name, described what he was holding. The briefcase containing launch codes for America's nuclear arsenal on social media, because he'd paid $200,000 for membership. Now ask yourself something. If that happened in public, what happened in private? Trump spent 150 days at Mar-a-Lago during his presidency. Xi Jinping held a state dinner there. Middle Eastern delegations negotiated in rooms designed to make people feel small. The same rooms Marjorie Post had used during World War II for the exact same purpose, just under different ownership. Here's what nobody wanted to admit. Mar-a-Lago was functioning as the Winter White House. The property the government had rejected as too expensive to secure, too difficult to protect, too impractical for presidential use, was now exactly that, under private control, where members weren't vetted by the State Department, where staff weren't cleared by the Secret Service, where the Presidential Records Act required documentation of every meeting, but the meetings happened in a building Trump owned. Public office, private property. The line disappeared. And when Trump left office in January 2021, he brought something with him. Boxes, packed in the White House, shipped to Mar-a-Lago. stored in a basement where anyone with access could have seen them. By May 2021, the National Archives started asking questions. Documents were missing. In January 2022, Trump returned 15 boxes. Inside, classified materials, top secret markings, intelligence that should never have left secure facilities. The archives called the FBI. In June 2022, investigators visited Mar-a-Lago. Trump's attorneys showed them a storage room, handed over more documents, signed a certification. Everything had been returned. The agents left, but someone inside didn't believe it. Someone who'd seen enough. On August 5th, 2022, a federal judge signed a search warrant. The Fortress Marjorie post built to hide treasures was about to be searched for secrets. Hit subscribe, because what they found proves the building does exactly what it was designed to do. August 8, 2022, 6:03 a.m. No sirens, no warnings. FBI agents arrived at Mar-a-Lago with a warrant signed 3 days earlier. They weren't searching a quiet presidential library. They were searching a fully operational club where 500 members had access, where events brought hundreds of guests per year, where foreign nationals attended dinners in the same building where America's nuclear secrets had been stored in a basement. The agents started in the storage room Trump's attorneys had shown them in June. They found 73 additional boxes. Boxes that Trump's lawyers had sworn, under penalty of perjury, didn't exist. They searched his office, his residence, spaces members never saw. By the time they left, 13,000 documents seized. Some marked top secret/SCI, intelligence requiring the highest clearances. No foreign nationals allowed access. HCS, protecting human sources whose lives depend on secrecy. And 48 empty folders marked classified. Empty. The documents that had been inside them were gone. The official statement called it unauthorized retention of national defense information. But here's what that phrase doesn't tell you. Someone inside Mar-a-Lago had to tell the FBI where to look. Someone who knew the layout, who'd seen the boxes, who understood Trump's attorneys were lying. Without that source, those documents might still be there, in rooms designed by Joseph Urban to keep secrets, in a building Marjorie posted filled with underground passages and sealed wings, in spaces where power had been hiding things for 95 years. The search made headlines for weeks. But it didn't answer the most important question. Who else saw those documents? Comment below. Do you think we know the full truth? Because what happened next proves power protects itself, even when caught. June 8, 2023. Federal grand jury. Miami. 37 counts. Willful retention of national defense information. Obstruction. Conspiracy. First criminal indictment of a former president in American history. The evidence was photographed, documented, boxes stacked in bathrooms, in ballrooms, in storage rooms. The case seemed impossible to lose. Then it was assigned to Judge Aileen Cannon, Trump appointee. 3 years on the bench. The trial date kept moving. May became July. July became August. August became indefinite. Every motion took weeks. Every hearing became complicated. Legal analysts called it unusual. But nobody called it what it was. A stall. July 15, 2024. Judge Cannon dismissed the entire case. Not because Trump was innocent. Because she ruled the special counsel's appointment was unconstitutional. A technicality most judges would have rejected immediately. The Justice Department appealed. But the appeal took time. November 2024. Trump won the presidency again. January 2025. He took office, and the moment he became president, the case became impossible to pursue. February 3rd, 2025, the classified documents were quietly returned to Mar-a-Lago. No press conference, no ceremony, just paperwork noting certain materials were released back to Trump's control. Because once he was president again, those documents became his to declassify. The case that seemed impossible to lose was lost. Not through acquittal, through time. Mar-a-Lago survived the same way it had survived for nearly a century. By enduring, by waiting, by outlasting everyone who tried to control it. There's a building in Palm Beach that cost $7 million to build in 1927. The woman who built it spent 5 years in Stalin's Moscow. She filled it with treasures and underground passages. She designed it to survive hurricanes and governments. She donated it to the United States. They gave it back. A developer bought it for $5 million, turned it into a club, became president, conducted diplomacy there, left office, stored classified secrets there, got searched, got indicted, got reelected, and the documents went back inside. Mar-a-Lago has been owned by wealth, by government, by private enterprise, but it has never belonged to the public. Not when Marjorie built it, not when Trump bought it, not now, because buildings like this aren't designed for the public. They're designed to show the public where they don't belong. Every gate is a reminder. Every membership fee is a boundary. Every restricted wing is a message. The classified documents are back inside those walls now. The federal agents are gone. The case is over. And Mar-a-Lago stands exactly where it always has. Bolted to coral reef. Built to outlast governments. Still keeping secrets. Still choosing who enters. Still enduring. Marjorie Merriweather Post died, believing her palace would serve presidents forever. She was right, just not the way she intended. If this story unsettled you, comment. If it made you think, like, if you don't want history buried behind gates, subscribe, comment, like, and share. Because power never dies. It just finds new addresses. And Mar-a-Lago will be standing long after we're all gone.